Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Winfrey, in your testimony, you discussed the impact that deregulation has on broadband prices. The current FCC seems intent on increasing its control and regulating every aspect of the Internet, most recently with its so-called net neutrality order. In your experience, what is the impact of highly regulated sectors of our economy, and what are the practical effects of the FCC's regulations on broadband prices?
Well, I talked in my testimony about one instance where the Congress stepped in and nullified a FCC rule, and we saw prices for both wired and wireless drop pretty significantly. For wireless, dropped 10%, and for wired, dropped 2%. But you know, taking a step back and asking what regulation generally does to prices, I mean, where we see highly regulated marketplaces, education, healthcare, transportation, we tend to see higher prices. So there's a direct connection between more regulation and higher prices. And there's a direct connection typically between more government involvement, even on the subsidy side, and higher prices.
So testimony before the committee today references data that for every dollar invested in ACP, GDP sees an almost fourfold increase. How do you respond to the findings presented in that white paper?
I have looked at the white paper. The co-authors of the white paper were a geographer at George Mason University and a high school senior in Fairfax County. And as an economist, I mean, quite frankly, it's a very impressive paper by a high school senior. I would love to have them as my student. The problem with the analysis is that it relies on what's called input-output analysis, which assumes that there is no change in a policy response on behavior. This is something that economists have known has been a suboptimal way to model things since the late 1970s. As a matter of fact, there was an economist at the University of Chicago, Bob Lucas, who won the Nobel Prize in 1995 for suggesting and showing that this kind of analysis has major challenges. So, you know, I think that there are better ways to do this, but I would take the $1 for $4 with a grain of salt.
And they used a static model, is essentially what you're saying?
It does use a static model, but again, sort of taking a step back, one of the main assumptions that it makes is that ACP doesn't actually exist. And all we're doing is adding ACP on top of an economy without modeling any of the behavioral impacts that ACP might have, including on prices, which is one of the sort of main components of my research, looking at the effect that ACP has on prices. The other thing that it doesn't do that's important, and I mentioned this earlier, is that for every dollar that we're spending right now, so since the beginning of 2020, 76% of all new spending since the first quarter of 2020 has been funded via debt, by new bonds, treasury bonds. 14% through money creation. Only 7% has been paid for with revenue. That's one of the reasons why we're seeing interest payments on the debt skyrocket and interest rates skyrocket. So for every dollar that you borrow to spend on something, you're paying 5.5% interest that rolls over on a 3-month basis, just given how Treasury has had to manage its debt management over the last couple of years. So that's one of the reasons why we're seeing inflation, and you need to take something like that into account if you're projecting the impacts of any program, ACP or any program, on economic growth.
Right, and it is a dynamic economy, which is why there are a lot of interactions, and those
right.
have to be mapped out as well. It seems like this was a fairly isolated study. Similarly, Chair Rosenworcel has been pushing an ACP, quote, fact sheet that states that, and I quote, more than 3/4 of respondents say losing their ACP benefit would disrupt their service by making them change their plan or drop internet service entirely, end quote. Is this actually what the FCC's survey data reveals, in your view?
So I think that there are two issues here. The first issue is, what does the survey data show? And then the second issue is is this survey something that we can rely upon? And this is actually following up on something that Ms. DeWitt mentioned a few moments ago in regards to making sure that we're getting the right information out of FCC to make policy decisions. So if you take the FCC's data as gospel, then it shows that only 15.7% of folks will lose broadband coverage if ACP goes away. Now, the problem is that the way the survey was conducted is they went out to 110 households, and only 5,300 and some households responded to the survey. Now, OMB says that when your survey response rate is under 70%, which is much higher in this case than the 5,300 and some odd households, you have to have a methodology, a new methodology for addressing that non-response rate. And so FCC didn't do that. And that's one of the challenges that I have as an economist and somebody who looks at government survey data on a regular basis. I don't even know how to read this survey. Like it might be representative, it might not be representative. The reality is that we just don't know, and we shouldn't be passing it along as if it is representative. Rather, we should ask FCC and potentially fund them to go collect more and better data on the program.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. Let me just close by saying there's been some discussion today, too, about the BEAD program. Our telecom providers were in town this week, and this is the co-ops, the independents, those that serve the most rural areas of South Dakota. And there isn't a single one of them that can use the BEAD program. And the reason is because of all the conditions and rules and regulations that the administration attaches to the program, many of which are completely unrealistic for the kind of service that these folks provide in rural areas of the country. So sometimes getting more government involved in some of these issues ends up not being a good solution. It ends up making matters worse. Thank you.